Again, just a quick reminder, there are some refreshments outside. You can slip away if you need to. And the restrooms are on either side if you need to go and take a break. In the meantime, let me introduce the moderator for this panel, Brad Richards. He's a partner at Haynes & Boone in the Houston office. He has more than 30 years of experience counseling companies in complex cross-border and domestic business and financial transactions. Richards has represented international banks, energy companies, entrepreneurs, consultants, service providers, project developers, and foreign investors in projects in South America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the former Soviet Union. The rest of his bio is also in the program. Thank you, Brad. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tony. Clearly, I think we all know that a new day has dawned for energy in Mexico. But Mexico doesn't operate in a vacuum, and we're going to take you maybe up a level from some of the detailed discussion, and we'd like to talk to you about the geopolitical and economic context for Mexico's energy reforms. I want you to pause for a moment and think about where we've come from. We've come from a period with Pemex as the primary symbol of energy nationalism, both in Mexico and really worldwide. Also, Pemex as a crutch for a Mexican economy. We've come from a period in which the world oil markets were booming, in which U.S. shale revolution was occurring for the past decade. We come from a period when the PRI has come back into power and has been eager to demonstrate that it is relevant to the Mexico of the 21st century. And we come from a period in which there has been severe capital constraints on Pemex and on, therefore, energy development in Mexico. So where are we today? Today we are at a point where Pemex is going to be restructured for efficiency, for operating in joint ventures, to working with other energy producers. We've come from a period, as Juan Carlos has already said, of increased transparency, of a desire to demonstrate that Mexico is a new and different kind of energy player in the world marketplace. We are in a period today where there's interest really from throughout the world. We know that there are bidders from Asia, from Europe, North America, and South America, potential bidders who are pre-qualifying. We also today are in a low price in oil environment, a bit of a surprise to even the most careful observers. So now what does tomorrow promise? Tomorrow promises some very interesting things. Tomorrow promises a day when the Mexican private sector is actively investing in oil and gas, something that we haven't seen. The prospect, as you've heard earlier, for a Mexico with increased oil and gas production, and the application of new technologies. When Juan Carlos put that slide up there and said this is really significant, that's really significant with the new geological understanding of the resources. And what that has meant in the United States has been the ability to apply new technologies, because the more that you know about the subsurface, the more that you can apply the correct type of technologies for the exploration and production of the hydrocarbons. You have the potential in the future for U.S. producers to play a positive role in Mexico and in the development. And finally, and what a lot of people have said, I think George mentioned it in his opening remarks, is we really have the prospect for a fully integrated North American energy marketplace, which is a very exciting prospect, because we all know that when integration occurs, efficiencies result. So if we're moving people, and if we are moving capital, and if we are moving resources across national boundaries, we're going to gain efficiencies, and therefore everybody will benefit. So this panel will discuss a lot of these issues in a very broad way, and I think I'm very, very fortunate to have on this panel three true experts talking about these types of issues. And I want to first introduce to my left Dr. Isidro Morales Moreno. He is a non-resident scholar here at the Mexico Center at the Baker Institute. He's also a senior professor and researcher at the Monterrey Institute of Technology. He has a doctorate in international relations from the Institut d'études politiques in Paris, and he also has a diplôme d'études approfondies from the same institution. He received his bachelor's degree in international relations from El Colegio de Mexico. He's the author of a book called Post-NAFTA North America, Reshaping the Economic and Political Governance of a Changing Region. If that doesn't describe something of what we're talking about, I don't know what does. Next to him is Dr. Kenneth Medlock, who is very well known here because he is the James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economic at the Baker Institute. He's also the Senior Director for the Center for Energy Studies. Dr. Medlock is an adjunct professor and lecturer in the Department of Economics. He's also an adjunct professor of civil and environmental engineering. He has a broad portfolio. Again, a guy who really understands the broad context, and he has a PhD in economics here from Rice University. And then finally, my partner Ariel Ramos. You received a brief introduction from Tony earlier. He's a partner in our Mexico City office, primarily focusing on transactions and the development and financing of infrastructure projects, particularly in the oil and gas, power, LNG markets. And he has a deep understanding of government procurement. He's been very active in the market. So he's also served as an adjunct professor of law, so you have a lot of professorial understanding on the panel today. And with that, I will begin by really addressing the elephant in the room. And what is the elephant in the room? We're in a low-price oil environment. What is that going to do to Mexico's energy reform? What could it mean? And I'll first direct that question to Dr. Morales.
Thank you, Brad, for your kind presentation. Thank you for the Baker Institute and Hens and Boone for their kind invitation. I think it's a very important question. And the fact that we have low prices, so to speak, and the Mexican mix is around $50 now, is not bad news. If we take into account that Mexico's cost of production are very low, they are around $6 per barrel average. And if you add exploration and capital investment, they are around $20, according to official figures and according to Pemex standards. So if we have a look to those standards, which is the average for international standards, I think that there's a room for extracting rents at $50. The question is with a new reform, because as we know, Pemex won't be the only producer in Mexico. And this links to a further panel. As Juan Carlos said, the government intake, the fiscal intake in the contracts is being done in such a way that as long as prices go up and the more of return of investments a company have, they will transfer more money to government. That's the way the adjustment mechanism is being done, as Carlos explained. And that's your concern for those that are participating in private companies. So I think that we have to balance, we have to explore, we have to assess those contracts, not only by what they say, but comparing them to other fiscal regimes prevalent in competitive areas. And I think that Mexico must attract capital from companies that are working already here in the Gulf of Mexico, in the US, from Brazil, from Colombia. I mean, we are not going to be compared with Iraq or Angola. No, we have to compare fiscal regimes according to those markets. And according to some studies, I'm not an expert, I'm a macroeconomist, but according to some studies that have been also addressed to the CNH, the prevailing contracts, the way they are structured, they are attractive at current prices, but as long as prices go up, when they reach $70 or $80, which is quite possible, not tomorrow, but in 2-3 years, they are not attractive anymore. And they are attractive for those companies that have high costs because of the mechanism that is being done. So there's no incentive to become more efficient in order to reduce your costs and enlarge your profits, because the more you enlarge your profits, the more you have to transfer to governments. This means that the contracts are very well done by Hacienda, because the Ministry of Treasury in Mexico has the goal, as Juan Carlos said, to optimize the extraction of oil rents, which is by law set in the energy reform. But the CNH has the challenge, it has a different challenge, because the CNH has to attract the best investors, the more efficient. So I think the contracts have a contradiction. And it has a contradiction the way they are designed, because CNH has not a say in the fiscal terms of the contract. It's Hacienda, and Hacienda does not care about attracting the best investors, but they do care about extracting most of the rent. So I think that the first round in July the 15th will be very interesting to know who are the winners, because we will know who are the companies that the Mexican government can attract with those contracts compared to fiscal regimes prevailing in the US Gulf of Mexico, in Brazil, and in Colombia.
As a follow-up question, do you think it's going to be important in that context for U.S. bidders to be in those groups, to for any, within the context of those comments, for symbolic or other reasons? For U.S. companies who are part of consortia to succeed? Having contacted on a formal basis with CEOs from American companies based in Mexico, they are interested. Yes, they are interested because they want to have presence. They want to pay the price in order to get information. Why they want to pay the price to get information? Because that's also very important to highlight. The energy reform, so to speak, open to private participation all chains of the industry. But, and this is a big but, according to Article 28 of the Constitution, upstream activities in hydrocarbons, which means exploration and production, are still considered strategic sector for government. And according to Article 25 of the Constitution, I'm not a lawyer, but we have lawyers here, only the state can control those activities. So this means that upstream activities are still under the control of the state. But of course, now it's legal to have private contracts. But this means that the state or the Ministry of Energy will have the final say in anything, in whatever it happens in those sectors. And that's why perhaps American company, even if not attractive, I don't know, it depends on the minimum intake, will participate because the way the reform is being done in some way compels participants to lobby government. I'm going to switch here for a moment to Ariel, and Ariel, I'd like you to comment a little bit within this pricing environment. What is the impact of the infrastructure, of Mexican infrastructure, on the question?
Well, I think that this is a really good question. I mean, what have we found after the opening of the oil and gas sector, specifically on the upstream? Well, guess what? I mean, this is a changing environment, and we don't like changing environments in Mexico. I mean, and you can say, well, you have suffered, economic crises, several economic crises, recurring economic crises. So how do you say that idea? Well, the truth is that in oil and gas, it was all Pemex. We were used to Pemex handling things, Pemex dealing with Hacienda, and they deciding and figure out how to manage the budget. But the truth is that now that the sector is open, well, welcome. It's a changing environment, so price doesn't necessarily need to follow the directives of any particular group, not OPEC, not Saudi Arabia, not anyone. And the truth is that nobody has the magic wand to understand exactly where the oil prices are going to be a year from now. Basically, everything is speculation. Now, 2 years ago, for instance, coming here, I started coming more often to Houston. And I remember that we were having a meeting, internal meeting with our energy advisors at the firm, and everything was talking about the U.S. and how the U.S. integrated with Canada, and how they were going to actually be able to compete, and whether the exportation ban of oil and gas, of oil more specifically, was going to be actually revoked or not. And I asked, hey, wait, where's Mexico and all of this? And they said, well, unfortunately, Mexico is sitting on the wrong side of the table. Well, guess what? 2 years from now, not even the people who like myself, who have been in the sector for almost 2 decades now, or other people have more. We knew that actually the reform was coming, but nobody could actually expect it, the level and the extent of and degree of the reform. And actually, this part has been outstanding. 2 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism in the market that, in general, about what things were going to happen. A year ago, more specifically, let's say last November, it was the other way around. Over optimism and people excited, and yes, things are coming. And now then oil prices drop and people are in a mix, right? Well, probably we should try to wait. But the truth is that this is a long-term industry, and the companies, at least the IOCs, the big boys, and the E&P companies know that they are looking for the assets, actually, the reserves on the long term. And we're not talking about having, like in REM rights or property rights over the reserves. What they want to have is the production rights. So the price is an issue? Yes, it's an issue. How will it impact? Well, from my perspective, it's more an issue about deciding on the portfolio of assets and reserves that CNH needs to handle, and deciding with the Ministry of Finance and with the Ministry of Energy what makes sense in terms of timing. I believe that, and from what I've heard, it has been a really good signal, a great signal to the market, the fact that CNH and the energy authorities have decided to keep up with round one and the sub-rounds. But the truth is that there are a number of reserves it was challenging before to actually develop those reserves, like, for instance, the shale reserves in the north part of Mexico or the northeast part of Mexico. It was challenging before. It's more challenging now with a $40, $50 barrel oil prices. But the truth is that there's a lot of potential there. And the truth is also that in the U.S., for instance, the development of certain reserves, all the leases, most of the new areas for developments have already been mapped, and now with the oil prices, people are starting to decide whether they're going to develop those or not. But the truth is that most of these companies, there's going to be a big adjustment in the market, and some of these companies are going to need to be restructured or probably gone by in the next year or so. But the truth is that a number of companies, they're going to have to decide at a certain point to go abroad. So the options are what? They're going to go to China, are they going to go to Argentina, or they're going to go to the north part of Mexico City, where it's closer and And I'm not saying easier to do E&P activities yet, but the truth is that these are the kind of questions that we need to manage. So just to summarize, I do believe that what we're experiencing right now, we're not going to see probably oil prices at the range of $100 as we did before, but it's in the best interest of the market at large to keep a stable price level. So we're going to have to wait, and the message, specifically for the Ministry of Finance, who is not used to long-term strategies. I mean, the Ministry of Finance in Mexico, we have an annual budget, so they actually focus on trying to have immediate results. Well, guess what? You know, we don't get immediate results in this industry. We have to wait, and this is an important bet. But what we have seen and we know in the market is that waiting and investing and taking the right steps actually pays off.
I'll push this question to Dr. Medlock now, but from the perspective of Pemex, here we have a national oil company that's right in the middle of all of this change, experiencing this. How do you see this impacting Pemex, whether because of the oil price itself or the overall context and how it creates new dynamics in their relationships with other parties?
I think that question is central really to how we gauge the long-term success of the current reform effort, to be honest with you. And I want to preface everything I want to say here. I could have listened to Juan Carlos for another hour, and that Q&A was fantastic, so I want to thank you for your remarks. But when we focus on Pemex specifically, long history to sort of move into a sort of new regime, transition into a sort of a different sort of mindset, if you will, when we think about the upstream in Mexico. We did a study here at the Baker Institute that we published at the end of 2010. And in that study, there were multiple parts of it. Cedro was actually part of that study as well, but there were multiple components of it. One of the things we did is we actually looked at the production outlook relative to demand growth for given levels of economic development in Mexico. And one of the things we highlighted was that the level of investment that had been seen through the first decade of this century really spelled doom and gloom, if you will, for the Mexican upstream sector. No matter how we sort of tweaked the model, you really saw Mexico becoming a net importer of oil by the early to mid-2020s, and that was kind of a bizarre thing to think about, really. But we also, in the context of doing that, evaluated and this was related to some work we had done on national oil companies, and we updated that work, evaluated the revenue efficiency of Pemex relative to all companies globally. And one of the things that kept falling out of the work was that Pemex was one of the least efficient firms in the international space. You could then take that work and then think about it, right, in terms of what drives the inefficiencies for different oil companies. And certainly one of the things we noticed is Pemex was burdened with things that a lot of other NOCs and IOCs were simply not burdened with. One of those things in particular, particularly during the middle of the last decade, was the government take. It was actually very, very high. And anybody who knows anything about the upstream oil and gas sector knows if you're not investing in finding new reserves, you basically die and go away. That's the nature of the beast when you talk about upstream oil and gas. And so they were saddled with this almost insurmountable sort of obstacle. And so when we start talking about reform, start thinking about what reform could mean for Pemex, it's actually quite dramatic. In particular, one of the things we're seeing is an invitation for international capital to flow into the upstream sector in Mexico. And I say it's an invitation because, quite frankly, we really don't know how successful in the long run this is going to be. And this brings me to two things that I've heard repeated over and over again so far this morning. And that's first one's rent extraction, and the second one is efficiency gain. Those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand with one another. So there's a really fine balancing act that has to be sort of orchestrated as we move along. And it's really in the hands of the Mexican government to make sure that they don't overstep when we talk about rent extraction, because it's very important that efficiencies that we know exist outside of Mexico are able to matriculate in. One of the things that we saw, going back to the relative revenue efficiency of Pemex, versus other companies, companies that were active in the international capital market tended to be very revenue efficient. You might ask, well, what does that mean? Basically, you're competing in a space where you have to be competitive for capital. When you're doing that, you have to make yourself very efficient. And so some NOCs that had actually partially privatized or fully privatized or moved into the international domain started making investments outside their borders over the last 20 years, you saw their revenue efficiency rankings rise dramatically. They started to make themselves look like the competition. So when we talk about Pemex and the introduction of international capital players into the upstream Mexican market, it really conveys that there's a lot of room to run for that potential benefit to matriculate into Pemex. Now, it's going to require Pemex to reform itself. And interestingly enough, we highlighted some of these things. And one of the things we highlighted in the work that we did was that, in the wake of reform, what Pemex will have to do is take a hard look at itself. Right. Think about its relatively low profitability or high cost ventures within the broader umbrella of Pemex and spin them off. Right. Think about ways to maximize revenue efficiency by focusing on various aspects of the core business. And interestingly enough, Emilio Lozoya was here a little over a week ago. I guess it was last week. And a lot of his remarks were indicative of exactly that plan forward for Pemex. So I think they're taking the right steps. And so the low price environment, in a lot of ways, can convey an acceleration of that mindset, because when margins are compressed, one of the things you try to do as a company is you try to figure out ways to improve margins. And one of the ways you do that is you actually trim fat, right? Or you try to start to cut things that aren't really as profitable as other things. So, ironically, the low price environment could actually accelerate what we all hope to come to pass for Pemex as we move forward.
That's a very interesting comment. You heard earlier Luis mention that he had been at Pemex 20 years ago, and thinking about that and the attitudes, people like Luis left Pemex because they saw an organization that was too inflexible. And then about 15 years ago, Professor Zamora, who's in the audience, invited me to go down to Mexico City and talk to Pemex about reforms. Just what could be done to attract more foreign investment into the oil and gas industry. And every single comment that we made, there was always, but we can't do that, but we can't do that, but we can't do that. It was an internally difficult for them to imagine the kind of reforms that now they're faced with, and the competition. Now there's competition. So Ariel has a comment, but before you begin, I wanted to ask Isidro a comment about this in terms of whether the reform is leveling the playing field between Pemex and private players in a way that would do this, and then I'll follow up.
Thank you very much. This is an excellent question. I agree with you, Ken, that private participation and competition will force Pemex to become more efficient. Is urgently needed. However, I suspect that Pemex will remain still protected. In this sense, the playing field is not leveled. It's not leveled first because in the governing board, the president is the Ministry of Energy. And the Ministry of Energy, as Juan Carlos said, is the person that will decide on the biddings. And the Ministry of Energy is the president of the Board of Regulators, because CNH and Senegas, the regulator for transportation of gas, and the CRE, the Energy Regulatory Commission, are part of a board of regulators whose president is the Secretary of Energy. So 3 hats for the same position. And we all know that the Secretary of Energy is appointed by the president. Following political considerations. As we all know, we have a politician as a director of the Secretary of Energy. So that shows, this says many things. But also in the reform, for example, if the Ministry of Energy considers that in a contract or in a block will be a significant transfer of technology, Pemex must participate with a minimum share, which is around 25%. On cross-border fields, Pemex must participate as well. And as we know, the reform also talks about some reserved areas, and Juan Carlos talked about that, some reserved areas that the executive decides when to do and when to release. But if you read the contracts, there was already a panel on the contracts. There are many requirements for private companies to gain a bid and to retain a bid, which is not exactly the case for Pemex. I know we all know that Pemex is supervised by CNH and by the Ministry of Energy, and there are many regulations. But as far as I know, Pemex didn't sign any contract with the government for gaining the leases, because Pemex only is entitled to receive leases, not contracts. Of course, they can compete later on. And I'm going to just put some examples of the asymmetry of treatment. For example, and it was discussed here, corruption. There's a corruption clause in the contracts, which we all are happy because of that, because we want to abate corruption in Mexico. And in the case of there is a conflict of interest, according to the contract, a contractor may have a contractual rescission, not administrative rescission, contractual rescission. We all know that in Mexico there are a lot of conflicts of interests. We have many scandals, and Pemex won't be the exception. We even have corruption in Pemex. But as far as I know, there's no contract saying that Pemex, in case of conflict of interest, will lose the assignments or the leases. That's one of the things. The other one is, for example, that CNH has to approve after 6 years of a development plan. CNH must approve the development plan, but it doesn't. The law doesn't say which are the conditions for CNH to accept a development plan. What happens if CNH does not approve a development plan of a company that has invested 6 years in exploration? So there are uncertainties, which is not the same with Pemex, because since in the board the Secretary of Energy is there, since the Secretary of Treasury is on the Pemex board, so those uncertainties are much more reduced for the national company than for a private one. Those are some examples. There are other ones.
I wanted to go ahead, Aurelio. You was it in direct response to this? Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just let me provide just a slight different view from Isidro's with respect to Pemex, because we deal with Pemex on a day-by-day basis, and we have seen exactly the contrary. I mean, Pemex is right now under siege and has not been, we believe that, has not received, the reform didn't provide really the right tools for Pemex to be able to compete in the market on the same level field. Not only that, but also the government has really been careful about not being shown that they are actually favoring Pemex. And the people and how do we see that? Well, first of all, with respect to round zero, for instance, and the different assignments that they received, there have been a lot of questions and the possibility and discussions about the possibility on revising these assignments, because there's no agreement between Pemex and CNER and CNH to extent I understand about really which kind of exclusivity they have with respect to all the reserves on similar blocks and what they can actually give to subcontractors and whatnot. The reform actually, for instance, the fact that Pemex can only award service contracts with payments in cash, this is really a big limitation for Pemex, and with respect to what they can do with the blocks and assignments of round zero. The fact that the officers of Pemex, except for the board members and are actually subject to the same regime as the responsibility of public servant as the other public servants at large is definitely a big limitation for Pemex, because people, if you actually read it at least in paper, this kind of regime, I mean, the officers respond with their own assets and can actually be not only convicted criminally, but also respond with their own houses and their own assets for any wrongdoing. And of course, this results in people doesn't want to sign anything. I mean, they want to have like signatures from everyone before actually somebody commits to sign any kind of contract. And this is an issue when you want the company to become more flexible, operatively speaking, and have the opportunity and the possibility to actually resolve some of the issues they have. The other big issue I see with respect to Pemex, which is another big limitation, is the fact that the budget of Pemex remains to be part of the federal budget. From my perspective, that is a mistake, because this creates, I mean, why do you need that budget in the federal budget? I mean, you just need to get the payments that Pemex needs to do to the government for them to pay actually their income tax. They were not actually a taxpayer for income tax or value-added tax before the reform. Now they will be. So why do you need actually the budget of Pemex? And actually these, we have the government sending wrong signals to the market. From one hand, the reform is supposed to give Pemex autonomy in aspects including autonomy, and on the other, when the budget cut of Pemex is announced by the Ministry of Finance, not by the Finance Department of Pemex, right? So I believe, at least right now, I think that one of the pending items of the reform is actually giving a clear path and a clear tools to Pemex to be able to actually restructure and I know that they are doing a big effort to try to figure these things out within the budget cut and also internally. But the truth is that Pemex used to be another branch of the government, and the mix of officers within Pemex, you had like the technical guys and you had like the political guys. And the mix remains there, and the way they are taking decisions is a little bit tough. So hopefully we definitely need a further reform at this point. The political time is not right. We have elections actually this next summer, midterm elections. So the timing is not there, but it would be convenient to actually revisit this at a certain point.
Just a very quick reaction. I mean, I agree with you in the sense that Pemex as a company is in the bad position in order to compete. I may even add the fact that Pemex is overstaffed. Ken made a wonderful job about that. And that liabilities, for example, for pensions and labor are huge. So in that sense, Pemex will be very difficult to compete. But this doesn't contradict the fact that the institutional, the regulatory environment is less transparent vis-a-vis Pemex than in the contrast for private firms. That's what I was arguing.
Very good. And I think this gives me a great opportunity to ask Dr. Medlock to comment on what Pemex needs to do going forward. What kind of additional reforms does it need to have, in order to have the prospect of kind of meeting the needs of Mexico for additional production from its national oil company?
Wow, that's a big question. I'm not going to pretend to know, all the complexities of the inner workings of Pemex and its relationship with the federal government. I mean, based on the conversation that we've just had, there's obviously tremendous uncertainty still about whether or not Pemex will be able to successfully reform in a time-efficient manner. But I'll go back to Lozoya's remarks last week. What he laid out in terms of the plans for either spinning off or actually seeking partnerships in different downstream entities, so in petrochemicals and refining. He laid a lot of different things out on the table. It looks very much like something that one of your Western international oil companies would consider doing in a similar type of environment. So I would say that the wheels are already being set in motion for success along those fronts. And again, in 5 minutes, I can't lay out everything he talked about in an hour, right? But suffice it to say, I think that they've begun moving in the right direction. One thing he did allude to and didn't really spend much time talking about, though, was the relationship between Pemex and the labor unions in Mexico. And that is something, going back to the work that we've done on the relative efficiency of national and international oil companies around the world, that is something that Pemex is saddled with that pretty much nobody else is very, very high labor costs. And so that's something that's going to have to be addressed. And quite frankly, given the relationship, it's a very unique relationship. It's going to probably have to be addressed at the federal level, not just within Pemex.
Oh, that's serious. We've spent a lot of time talking about two pachyderms, prices and Pemex. Those have been the elephants in the room. I might give an opportunity, a brief opportunity for our panel to talk about the competition from elsewhere in the world and what that might do in terms of affecting the real pace of reforms and the ability to complete the reforms. And I might start again back with you, Dr. Medlock, if you have a thought on that subject. Then I'll ask each of our other two panelists to comment as well.
Yeah, so to answer this question, we kind of have to do a tour around the world, right? So, and you kind of have to do this in the context of global demand for crude oil and petroleum products and natural gas is going to continue to grow. So it's not a, if I invest here, I want to invest there story. I think that's a really important point. But if you look around the world and you look at opportunities for international oil companies in particular to invest in resources, and some national oil companies that are very international. So we heard from CNOOC, I think, this morning, and that's a very vibrant player in the international domain as well. So it's one that we also have to consider. But you've got places where production is growing and there is a large amount of reserve potential. But in every place there are above ground issues that have to be grappled with. So we can talk about Iraq. We could, should sanctions be lifted, eventually talk about Iran. We could talk about Russia, in particular northern Russia and the Arctic and some of the developments up there. But everything that I just said has a lot of hair on it, so to speak. So, if you're one of these players in the international domain and you're thinking about where to sink capital, Mexico becomes increasingly attractive should the terms play out well, all right? Brazil's also in that domain, Argentina's in that domain, Colombia's in that domain. I would say among all the countries I just listed, the only two places where you're really seeing any vibrancy are in Colombia and in Iraq, which, by the way, Iraqi oil production is setting another record this month in terms of its rate of increase. So, and that's despite everything that's going on. So it tells you that even if there are above ground issues, if other things are done well, things can happen very, very favorably. So with regard to Mexico, it enjoys an advantage that none of those other countries happens to enjoy, though. It has a geology that is tangential to geology that we know a lot about, that there already are international oil companies very active in particular in the Gulf of Mexico. There's still a lot of work to be done. So the comments this morning about seismic work that's going on, I think, are very, very important. And quite frankly, I don't think you can actually set a reserve price for any of those bids until you know a little bit more about what's underneath you. So it makes perfect sense. It hasn't really been announced yet. But all that notwithstanding, there's a huge opportunity that Mexico can seize upon. And I think that's actually very, very important given the broader international context. Now, I talk a lot about growth and demand and where supply will come from, and I don't have a formal presentation up here behind me or anything, but there's a interesting sort of set of dynamics I think that everybody ought to be aware of. Demand growth is projected to continue along a pretty favorable path. The work that we've done at the Baker Institute, we could see actually closing in on 110 million barrels, 120 million barrels a day by 2040. That means we're going to have to find supply in lots of different places that we're not necessarily used to finding supply. You go around the world and you look at where supply growth has occurred in the last 5 years, and you see the U.S. is by far the leader. But it's not the only place where you've seen supply growth. You've seen supply growth in Colombia, you've seen supply growth in Saudi Arabia, you've seen growth in Iraq, a handful of other places, Canada. But then you sort of flip the ledger and say, where has production declined? Venezuela, Mexico, Iran, Libya, You sort of walk through the list, and what's really interesting, you've also seen a decline in North Sea provinces, so in Norway and the UK. There are a couple of places in that list, actually, that it's all because of geology. Right? Natural decline is going to occur, particularly in your more difficult environments, and so we can cross off the North Sea. But then you get to the rest of the list, and there's nothing about the geology that dictates production should be falling. Right? You start to boil it down to above ground issues, and a lot of those places, particularly the places in the Middle East and North African region, are going to be, for most analysts that study the area, facing a lot of political difficulties going forward. Those aren't going to go away. Those issues aren't going to go away. But then you start looking at elsewhere in the world where production assets could actually prove to be very viable, and you can see production growth. Canada, U.S., Mexico, Venezuela, should things shape up, because there's a massive resource base there. Colombia, obviously. Brazil, Argentina. I want you to notice something. I haven't left the Western Hemisphere. So there's a real potential for lines of trade in the global oil market to be completely redrawn over the next couple of decades. And Mexico, along with the United States and Canada, stands to be at the centerpiece of that evolution, if you will. But again, it's very important that capital markets find Mexico an attractive place to invest.
I want to give my other two panelists a moment to comment if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, just pretty quickly. I guess that, again, as I said before, this is a changing environment, and 2 years ago, who would have predicted, what would happen in Brazil, what would happen in 3 years ago, or what would happen with Argentina. So I think that it's a good moment for Mexico, despite of everything that is happening. Of course, there are challenges. For instance, the lack of infrastructure on key parts of the country, including pipelines, not only for gas, but oil pipelines, which are of the essence. The growth of actually key infrastructure like ports, for instance, where we need actually for them to become actually multimodal type of transportation and logistic port, hubs that we don't have here in Mexico. Well structured. Of course, there's an Energy Council which will need to address all these issues and focus and coordinate with the other ministries in charge of development of infrastructure. The issue of security is another challenge. But the truth is that the oil industry is used to deal with security issues. There are protocols. Of course, it comes at the end a matter of cost. And who's going to absorb the cost? According to what we have discussed with our clients, they say, yes, we can actually implement security protocols and bring people, but I need my people to have clearance to do whatever they need to do. And that operative part of the cost should not come from us. This should come from the governmental, the governmental piece. So I believe that despite of the decline of oil prices, I think that this actually creates a good moment for Mexico. Also, there's a good advantage which Mexico needs to account on, and this is the fact that although the development of new reserves, especially non-conventional reserves, deep water, is complex, actually as discussed, there is a lot of experience of that Mexico can benefit on and should benefit on from what has happened here in the U.S., from what happened in the north part of the Gulf of Mexico and other parts of the world. Actually, one time I was we were trying to wonder, which kind of standards, for instance, environmental standards would Mexico implement for Shell. And somebody said, well, it's pretty easy, just bring the standards in Texas. Well, probably that could work in the north part of Mexico and the continuation for the Eagle Ford, but there are other basins where these standards might not be the correct standards. Probably you would need to look for additional standards. So, but the good news is that Mexico should benefit from the things that have done abroad. And also, I believe that Mexico should have a continuing dialogue with its immediate partners, Canada and the U.S. Team up more with them, share more information with them, and try to benefit to the extent possible investors from these countries, because actually that's the natural source of investment for us.
Well, I agree with my colleagues in the sense that Mexico is a a good place for investment, no doubt. And I think that this reform could make a more integrated North America, and to make North America become the swing producer of hydrocarbon in the world, which will have a geopolitical consequence in the Middle East, definitely. However, I think that Mexico must be cautious, or must could improve. We are still in a learning curve about fiscal regimes operating here in the Gulf of Mexico and Colombia and Brazil. I understand that the Ministry of Treasury wants to optimize the oil rent, but an equilibrium must be reached between extracting the oil rent and attracting the best investors. The other one is that, for example, in this bidding, only big companies, as it was said in the previous panel, can participate. A big company above 1.6 million barrels. But if you look at Brazil, for example, the Libra field, which is going to be explored and developed next year, encompasses many big companies with Petrobras. So perhaps if we want to move in deep waters, Mexico must be more flexible in order to allow coalitions with other major producers. And then, as Ariel said, security is not a problem, but it's a cost. And currently, Mexico, the Mexican army protects Pemex premises and Pemex's pipelines. So we have to also to invest on infrastructure and on pipelines and gas lines. But who's going to protect them? Because organized crime, as we know, smuggled energy, smuggled oil from pipelines. So in Pemex's case, is the army. But for private firms, are they going to bear the cost of that? Or the army will protect those private installations? That's all the question mark.
Well, you know, one of the things that, one of my takeaways from this most recent discussion is that you heard it here first. This is going to be the decade of the Western Hemisphere energy markets. Lots of good things could be happening in our hemisphere going forward. I have an additional line of inquiry, but I'm going to hold it and ask first if there are questions from the audience that you would like to address to the panel. And if so, if you would step up to the microphone or wait for the microphone to be brought to you.
And thanks for a great discussion. Since we've been here, I got a quick email on my phone. I checked it. It said illegal pipeline taps are up 58% in the first quarter since last year. So respecting the Army and trying to get a hold of that, obviously serious security challenges remain. And I think there's a third dimension of that. We have a presence in North Kenya, for instance, and we've seen oil and gas operators move into North Kenya, and there be security problems caused by now tribes fighting sort of one another for rights to land that they perceive they're going to accrue a benefit from in the future. In North Mexico in particular, where communities are very often somewhat captive to drug trafficking organizations, how much of the impetus will fall on companies moving into that environment to sort of handle that risk so that their presence doesn't cause the kind of human rights problems, for example, or security problems in the region that could be hung around their neck, since international best practice rather than prudence is sort of the new standard. Because in the international realm, people are sort of looking more at operators as owning a little bit of that human rights risk. Thank you.
Go ahead, Ariel.
I guess this goes back a little bit to the issue we were talking about, cooperation with the U.S. and allowing certain type of international protocols to be able to be implemented in Mexico. I believe that the only way to overthrow a multi-billion-dollar type of industries is with another multi-billion-dollar type of industry, and this is basically the opportunity. Now, the security issue is more of an issue on the onshore than on the offshore, of course, and as Cesar was saying, the Army is not going to be able to actually be there to protect everyone. Unfortunately, some of the reserves in the north part of Mexico are precisely located in the long time routes of drug trafficking to the U.S. And the type of answers we are finding right now are basically no answers. Like, we talked to the guys who were working on for instance, on Los Ramones pipeline, and they said, so how are you dealing with this? And the answer was, well, we have like a non-talked agreement with this guy. So as long as we work in certain hours and and they don't mess with us. I mean, that's not the kind of answer we're looking for. We're looking for more specific ways to address this issue and give security, because there are a number of industries, especially on the oil service side, who are just newcomers and have been really successful in the U.S., but not necessarily are used to these issues and are not willing to address these issues probably in Mexico. So we need to assure that we give opportunity to everyone that wants to participate to the extent possible. And this requires also a strategy that makes sense, not only in the southern Mexico, but also in northern Mexico. And the reality of insecurity in one part of the country and the other is pretty different. We have suffered about what we call the cockroach effect, right? I mean, they crashed like a head of a drug cartel, and then you had like a number of other smaller groups coming out. I mean, there has been progress, but progress needs to get more progress needs to be achieved.
Thank you, sir. I will start with a clarification, and then I will make my question. This is regarding the comments made by my friend, Dr. Isidro Morales, regarding the board of CNH. So I just want to make clear that the Ministry of Energy is not part of the board of CNH. The board of CNH is integrated by 7 commissioners appointed by the Senate, by 2/3 of the Senate. It's a very peculiar agency because we are part of the executive branch, but we are fully technically autonomous, and we are actually financial self-sufficient. I actually don't know and haven't seen in the international experience, and then I will ask you to comment on that. I haven't seen across the world any other upstream regulatory agency so technically autonomous as CNH, considering that this board is appointed by 2/3 of the Senate. Naturally, once we're appointed, we cannot be removed from office. It's the only upstream regulatory agency that I have seen in the constitution of any country, as we are. So I would like to ask you whether you know any other upstream regulatory agency as autonomous as CNH. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right, Juan Carlos. I mean, CNH is independent. I mean, it has its own budget, and there was a long discussion about giving constitutional independence, and they were not granted because at the end of the day, it's a government entity, which is correct. But I was not saying that. I didn't say that the Ministry of Energy was part of the board of CNH, no. But there is a board of regulators in which CNH participates, as well as CRE and SENACE, and is presided by the Ministry of Energy. That's what I wanted to say. Perhaps I rephrased it badly. But it shows that the Secretary of Energy has a say, has a clue in the regulators. That's what I'm saying. And at the same time, the Ministry of Energy is part of the governing board of Pemex, that's for sure, as well as Hacienda. And at the same time, the Ministry of Energy finally approves the bidding. That's what I'm saying. So in that sense, the institutional architecture gives enormous power to the Ministry of Energy in relation with the regulators, in relation with firms.
And just Juan Carlos, I think it's a great question because off the top of my head, I can't come up with in fact, typically the Minister of Energy has even more power in other jurisdictions than as described. But if anybody has a different understanding, I'll, contradict me. If otherwise, I'll go to the next question.
Thank you, Brad. I just want to take a minute to highlight the richness of this interchange. And we just had the president of the Commission of Natural Hydrocarbons of Mexico ask a question back to the panel, which I thought was really A+. But my question relates, I want to take advantage of the scholarship on the panel to ask, because I'm sure each of you has thought profoundly about what the promise of a Western Hemisphere, of a North American fully integrated oil and gas energy structure might look like. And if you could share with the group assembled here what the real potential game changers are in terms of, for instance, you can think about impact on other sectors, impact on manufacturing in North America. What that means for employment growth on the manufacturing side. I mean, we see today what's happening, for instance, in cities like Baltimore and previously in Detroit. Imagine what manufacturing rebirth in North America might mean for employment, not just in Mexico, but also in the United States. I wonder what other sort of tertiary and other impacts that if we're able to actually arrive at this goal, what that might mean, and then also what potential reactions to that there might be, for instance, from current manufacturing sectors across the globe in China and other sectors of Asia, et cetera. It seems to me this is a really incredibly unique opportunity for North America. And we're all interested in the success of Mexico because it also means the success of the United States. And I wonder what sort of game-changing thoughts the panel has had on this topic.
I might put Dr. Medlock on the spot on this question, but it is a very interesting one, George, I agree, and I think one that everybody in the room ought to be contemplating.
Well, I'll say two things, and actually partially in response to the previous question as well. But when you look at regulatory environments and regulatory institutions and regulatory bodies that establish market structures, honestly to me, and this is not meant to be a U.S.-centric statement, but what exists in the United States is unique, and it actually is what has led to the success in the upstream sector that we've seen here. 80% of land-based rigs globally are found in North America, and a lot of those are actually in the United States, and there's a reason for that, right? It's actually what makes the industry so flexible and nimble, so that it can respond very quickly to changes in demands and other market pressures. But thinking about, George's question, wrote a paper about almost a year ago now for a conference that Goldman Sachs put on, thinking about, the North American energy equation. And my charge in putting that piece together was really thinking more broadly about how NAFTA provides a blueprint for thinking about a shift in the energy landscape in North America and what that could mean, for the position of North America in the global context. And there's a lot there. I'll just point out some key highlights, and I'm going to say this despite what I just said about the U.S.'s unique regulatory institutions, but barriers to trade in general do not beget success on that front. And what you see in the United States are trade barriers being erected either as a result of other motivations, so for example, environmental policy, and this gets to pipeline construction. I don't think I need to say the name of the pipeline, everybody knows it, right? But, and then there are barriers to trade that exist simply because they're artifacts of a time that's gone by. And this is the oil export discussion. And we recently did a very large study on that as well, which is available online, and basically, it doesn't make any sense. The current ban on exports from the United States already presents a binding constraint. It's actually putting pressure on upstream viability, which, quite frankly, will promote opportunity in Mexico and other places for capital flow, should the ban remain in place. But that doesn't mean that you get a better outcome. In fact, if the barriers to trade were absolved, what you would likely see is Canadian oil flowing down into the Gulf states, the United States. First barrel that displaces is a barrel of Venezuelan crude. You'd also see light oil from the United States being exported, and guess where one of the export destinations would be? It would be refineries in Mexico. So you would actually see a much more vibrant trade within the North American context, which I don't want to say would lead to energy independence, but it would certainly shift the balance of power in the energy discussions and change geopolitical context for lots of other foreign policy discussions that have been going on for the last 40 years. So, there's a lot of different things that sort of play into that equation, and certainly the success of energy reform in Mexico is one of them. But being able to access in a free and very fungible way supplies from everywhere in the world is critical really to the success of that sort of new North American image, if you will. And that's one of the things that barriers to trade prevent, is ultimately fungibility. It distorts capital flows, it distorts pricing signals, it creates all sorts of distortions that in the long run lead to less efficient outcomes. And so when we start talking about oil from North America and more generally North American energy, we really have to keep in mind what we ought to be targeting is market efficiency, because that, at the end of the day, is what's going to convey a lot of those benefits.
So we need energy reform in the United States.
We have, I think, time for one more question.
There's been a lot of discussion about rent extraction here. How does Mexico compare to other countries? The mechanisms in place, or at least contemplated in rounds 1 and 2. Are other countries less restrictive, give more of an upside, or how does that play in?
I can comment on that briefly. I mean, the way the contract structure was laid out, right, by Juan Carlos, basically you have cost oil, which is basically going to allow companies to recover costs, and then the majority of the profit oil is going to the host government, and that's pretty typical, right? You usually see an 80-20 split. That's pretty much international average. So, the comments that Juan Carlos made were very on point. That is basically competitive. Now, there are variations on the theme, and you can actually see rent extraction through different mechanisms like local content requirements and other things. And so I think that's where the discussion needs to eventually center, is on those issues, which is actually why I raised the issue of the labor unions, because ultimately that's going to be an important point.
Thank you.
We have had a wonderful discussion, and I hope you will join me in thanking our panelists for their expertise and for their time this morning.